What's going on, people? Welcome to another episode of the Athletes to Athletes podcast. I hope you all had a great holiday. Before we sat down and shared a heavy meal with our family and friends, I caught up with former Western Kentucky runner Katie Lever, who hung up her running shoes and has since become an NCAA researcher and doctoral candidate in Austin at the University of Texas. As always, we discuss recruiting, her athletic career path, and what happened during her career that made her want to peel back the curtain on NCAA policy. So again, welcome back to the A2A podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. So back with another A2A podcast, and today sitting down with Katie. And Katie, I really appreciate you taking some time out. I know we've tried to collaborate before. I had a little bit of technical difficulties. You came down with a little bit of a sickness, but now we're all healthy. We're all good to go. So Katie, welcome to the A2A podcast. And as we always start, I'm going to allow you to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you, your background, where you're from, what sport you played, and anything else.
Yeah, thank you so much for being flexible the last few weeks, Ryan. I know this time of the year is always crazy, so I appreciate us trying to get this in before Thanksgiving and just with everything coming up, I appreciate your flexibility. But yeah, my name is Katie Lever. I am a former Division I athlete. I ran track and cross country at Western Kentucky University, mid-major university in Southern Kentucky. And I wasn't always a runner. I was really big into basketball and softball. I played every sport I could try before I was like, well, maybe I should try running. And then when I did, it worked out well for me. I had a bit of a mixed experience in college. I had some difficulty adjusting at first to the NCAA Division I level. It was very difficult for me. And then once I got really well established as a runner, I just got injury after injury after injury. So I did well for a while at the Division I level. I understood really what it took to get there and what it took to do well. Unfortunately for me, I was one of those athletes where injuries really derailed my career. Once injuries started, I also had some abusive coaches, to deal with as well. When I started getting injured, that was when that started happening. So that was a really complicated time for me, because college really was the best time of my life and also the worst time of my life. So, based on those experiences, I went to grad school. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do as a graduate student, from a research perspective. And a mentor of mine, Dr. Angie Jerome, who is also at WKU, she advised me to start researching the NCAA. And so I was like, okay, cool. I've got these experiences, I had a bit of a mixed bag as an athlete. I want to understand more of the systemic issues and just the structure of the NCAA. And so that was how I really got involved with policy research, which is now what I do as a doctoral candidate at the University of Texas.
That's pretty awesome. So, you said as you grew up just playing every single sport, where did that influence come from? Was it more parent influence? Was it sibling? Was it friends? What made you want to, start dribbling a basketball, start running, just start competing?
I love that question so much. It was really a lot to do with my parents. They were both college athletes. My mom was also a runner at Western Kentucky, and my dad shot rifle at the Citadel. So, and he's still is a professional or he was a semi-professional cyclist, and he's still competitive today. So he's still really into the athletic space. My mom keeps up with WKU sports. She's the most diehard Hilltopper fan that I know, because my grandpa was a football player there as well. And so we have a ton of WKU pride in my family. And so it was really growing up with that influence that made me want to get into sports. And then also my family's background is sort of unique because from a gender perspective, we don't have gender norms in my family, because my mom was the breadwinner growing up and my dad stayed at home. And so I really grew up with this mindset of women can do anything, I can do whatever the boys can do. And that's something even, because I'm a millennial, that's something that I don't see all of my peers necessarily having growing up. And so they're having to kind of make up for lost time, as they're trying to climb the career ladder as women who, didn't grow up with the kind of messaging that I did, because my dad was, he was super intentional in making sure that we watch women's sports growing up too. And we're talking about like the 90s. It wasn't always easy
Mm-hmm.
to find women's sports on TV, and it's still not as easy as it should be. When, you know, women's sports get about 5% of overall coverage on major news network or major sports news networks, it's not always easy to find women's sports. But I grew up with that influence of, you know, we're going to find professional softball and college softball on TV. Same with basketball. One of my birthdays fell on Pat Summitt's 1,000th career win. And so like I grew up with all of these really strong female athlete role models because my dad was like, we have to make sure that Katie, you know, can see herself on TV as much as possible. So I was very lucky to have grown up in a household like that. And to this day, I'm a huge like women's sports fan. I loved watching the WNBA playoffs this past season. Yesterday, South Carolina and Stanford faced off, and that was an incredible game. And I'm really looking forward to college softball season as well. But all of that started in the home for me.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That's a very different perspective, right? Where most parents are like, we're just gonna watch sports, but no, we're gonna make sure we watch female sports. We want you to see yourself excelling. Now, as a kid growing up in an atmosphere like that, where you watched your mom, you know, be the hustler, I guess you want to say, you know, she's the one going out and getting it, and your dad is the one influencing you and showing you the kind of the mirror image of what you can be. Is that what made you want to get into softball and soccer and basketball and all these different sports, and then even look past high school onto that next level?
Yeah, it was really, I think that I didn't have any restraints on me. You know, it wasn't like this is what men should do and this is what women should do. It was more like I could really do whatever I wanted to do. And just having that
Mm-hmm.
freedom, which I don't think that girls get as much as boys do growing up, was so instrumental for me. And then it really was, you know, my dad being really intentional in making sure that I saw myself on TV. Because like you said, it's one thing to watch like the NBA or Major League Baseball as a young girl and say like, oh, that's really cool. I like watching sports. But it's completely different to actually see athletes that look like you on TV and say, oh, I like watching sports and I can also play this sport. So I think that's such a huge component to, you know, why I was so interested in sports from a young age and how I always saw myself as an athlete.
Mm-hmm. So as you're getting older, and you know, something that we see a little bit changing more now is athletes aren't centralizing as much, right? You see more multi-sport athletes, whereas I think what 10, 15 years ago, you saw coaches that said, I want my soccer players playing for their high school, playing club soccer, playing travel soccer, and just eat, sleep, and breathe soccer. But now you see it more where it's like, I want these girls to be on the basketball court, on the tennis court, as well as playing soccer. Was that kind of the way that you grew up, in the sense of, I'm just going to do everything because it's all going to benefit? And as you continued, how did you start to hone in on what you were better at as you tried basically everything?
Yeah, I really see that dynamic playing out in youth sports now where, you know, from the moment an athlete can walk, it's like, oh, we have to get them into like travel baseball or whatever specialized sport that's out there. And I see that so much as a business move, you know, because like Little League baseball and just youth sports in general are such a huge business. I think that all happens because of that trickle down effect from college sports where, you know, parents are like, oh, you know, college is expensive. I need to pay for my child's education. So like a D1 scholarship is a good way to do that. And I think a lot of that comes from misinformation too, because people don't
Mm-hmm.
understand that it's very, very hard to get to the scholarship level, whether that's at D2 or D1, because D3, there aren't any scholarships available.
Mm-hmm.
But it's super hard to get to that level. And then once you do, the vast majority of college scholarships aren't even full rides. And so what I see a lot is parents, you know, they're putting down 10, 20, 30, $40,000 over the course of their child's career, for athletics at least. And then they maybe see a few thousand of that back in terms of athletic scholarship aid. So like I always tell parents, you know, if you have a child who's athletically inclined, that's great, but you don't want to bank on that. You want to make sure that you're getting as much, you know, academic aid as possible, that they're making good grades so they can keep their scholarship, and that they have an academic foundation if they get hurt and something happens to their scholarship as a result. Um, So like it's for that reason that I really don't agree with specialization at an early age because, you know, you do have a lot of potential for injury. It's really common in baseball for pitchers, like very young pitchers, to have Tommy John surgery because of that pressure. And it's like at 14 years old, you're way too young to be getting that surgery.
Hmm.
So I don't agree with it, like from an injury perspective and just from a burnout perspective. Like it's so easy when you're a kid and your sport becomes your job to get burnt out on it. So I don't agree with that. My dad again was like very intentional in making sure that I had the freedom to do as many sports as I wanted to do. You know, because my mom was a distance runner in college, and that's a sport that does take a lot of specialization, but she never pressured me to get into distance running. And I only really ran track in high school as a way to train for softball. I remember it was one practice my sophomore year. It was preseason softball, and I was in the outfield. And I went to dive for a ball. That was like my favorite thing to do as a softball player was dive for balls. And I dove into the second baseman in the process that time, and she fell on my back. So that caused a back injury for me. And I had to miss out the first few weeks of my season, and I lost my starting job as a result. And so during that time, I was like, well, you know, if I were in better shape, maybe I wouldn't have gotten hurt or I could have bounced back sooner. And so the summer of my junior year, I started really, really investing into myself as a runner. And that was when I saw my time start to drop. And that was when I made the decision to specialize in distance running as a junior in high school. Because I had coaches who were emailing me and they were saying like, you know, Katie, your times are looking really good. What are your plans for running in college? And I was like, I don't have plans to run in college. Like I was like, what are you talking about? But it was really people, you know, reaching out to me and encouraging me that gave me the confidence to really commit to one sport. But I didn't do it like as a middle schooler or, you know, even as like a freshman in college. I waited until my junior year. And I had, you know, I have good athletic genes for it. So that definitely helps. But I think a lot of what got me into running at the college level was just not being injured and not being burnt out before I got to that point in my recruiting process.
Hmm. So, seeing as you didn't really start to think of that next level, at least of athletics, until your junior year, what were your plans around colleges? Were you looking more academic at that point and kind of letting the athletic chips fall where they may, or was it something that all kind of came together as you started getting letters for, your times dropping?
Yeah, it's funny because for years I special well, and I say specialize because I did emphasize softball conditioning and training. I really, really wanted to play at the collegiate level as a softball player, but my problem was that I was not a good hitter in softball. Like I was great defensively, I was a decent pitcher, but like I could not hit the ball to save my life. And so that was my big problem as a softball player was my lack of offense. But like that was the sport that I put a lot of time and energy into when I was in middle school. And I thankfully that wasn't the only thing that I was doing. You know, I was also playing basketball in the off season. I was running track. And so I really viewed it all as sort of a way to better myself in softball while not being injured. So softball was like my plan A for a long, long time
Mm.
until that point in my recruiting process where it's like, oh, I could actually do better in distance running because I was getting like D3 offers in softball. It wasn't anything really to shake a stick at. You know, I mean, it was, and you know, to be clear, I don't want to say that like D3 is not like a good option because it can be a good option for recruits who are looking to make it to the college level. It's just not a
Mhm.
great way to necessarily pay for college if you want to do that with an athletic scholarship. So like
Mhm.
D3 wasn't the best fit for me. And I would really have to go like D2 or D1 to reach my goals as a college athlete. And that's going to look very, very different for everybody. So I was getting some D3 offers for softball, but it really wasn't the best fit for what I wanted to do with my career. I was also looking to get into college for broadcasting, and there aren't a lot of D3 schools out there that have really good broadcasting programs. Western
Mhm.
Kentucky has a really, really excellent broadcasting program. I changed my major twice in college, so like none of that worked out for me. But you know,
Yeah.
at the time, I was really looking at it from like an academic standpoint and what I could do there. But I was looking to reach my academic goals through an athletic scholarship. And softball wasn't going to do that for me. And so that was why one of the reasons why I made that switch my junior year was because I saw a lot more scholarship potential for me as a runner than I had as a softball player.
Mhm. And when we first started our conversation, you mentioned your family lineage with the school that you ended up going to with Western Kentucky. Um, was that one of the schools that was on your radar because of your family, or did that kind of come to fruition later on when you start getting these letters and start getting attention?
Yeah, WKU was definitely on my radar for a long time in just my overall college process. My mom and my grandpa though, like they were very good at not pressuring me. Like my mom, we went on a bunch of official visits together. Like we went to Tennessee Tech. We'd considered going to like U of L for some official visits. So like she came with me to a lot of these trips. And the whole time she wasn't like whispering in my ear, like, oh, you should really go to Western though. She was like, oh, I really like Murray State, Katie. Like you should put them on your radar. This is a good school and I could see you fitting in there. And like we talked about like financials. We talked about, academics and the educational implications of my choices. So she was really, really helpful for me in weighing my options and being really logical about it, without having, the emotional attachment to WKU in that recruiting process. We did end up going, to Western on an official visit as well. But she didn't treat that visit any different than she did my other visits. And so I was really grateful to have her, like as a resource in my recruiting process, and not as someone who was trying to pressure me into going to her alma mater as well. I just so happened to arrive at that choice, but I feel like it really was my own decision, which is something I'm always super, super grateful for looking back on it.
hmm So how did you come to that conclusion? You do have, like you said, the family lineage. The family has gone to the same school. Your mom's not pressuring you. Your grandfather's not pressuring you. You come to this conclusion all on your own. How do you get there from, visiting Murray State and visiting all these other schools? How do you get to, I'm going to go to my family alma mater from all these other visits?
Yeah, so I looked at it from a few different perspectives. So academics were super important to me. And that was something I was so grateful. Tony Cox, who was a cross country coach at Tennessee Tech when I was looking at them, he was very honest with me about my academic goals and how Tennessee Tech might not be the best fit for me. He was also very honest. He was like, Katie, I could offer you a full ride if that's what it takes to get you here. But I want you to know that we have a journalism program that's very good. We don't have a broadcasting program. So like right
hmm
off the bat was super, super honest with me. And and he was a very good supporter of me during my collegiate career as well. So I'm always super grateful for Coach Cox and just how he went about recruiting me in a very honest way. So I definitely looked at the academic implications of, my college choice, because that, in my opinion, should be the number one priority for recruits. So Western really fit the bill with broadcasting. From a location perspective, it was also perfect because my family's in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. So that's about an hour away from Bowling Green, Kentucky. So it was great because I had my family within reach, but they also weren't in my backyard. So I felt a good sense of independence and being able to like make those independent life decisions on my own, while also
hmm
having my family within reach if I needed them. So like the location aspect was really good. And then I also looked at it from a competitive perspective as well, because I didn't want to be the best runner on the team, but I also wanted to be on the travel squad. I wanted to be able to like go to meets and be able to compete. So I wanted to be kind of a middle of the pack runner wherever I went to college. That was one of the things that kind of led me away from Tennessee Tech as well, because I would have been the number one runner on the team, and I knew that, as a high school athlete, it's super tempting to want to jump onto a team and automatically be the best runner. But I knew that I wasn't in the upper tier of Division I runners where I wanted to be, and that being a middle of the pack runner was my way to get there. By working hard and earning a spot, and while also not being overwhelmed by the competitiveness and just the change in competitiveness between high school sports and college sports. So when I was looking at schools, I was also looking at rosters and seeing like where I was going to fit in time wise with everybody else who was already on the team. And I always recommend that athletes do that in the recruiting process. Like, you obviously want to look at it from an academic standpoint. You want to make sure logistically that the school works for you from like a travel perspective and where your family is. But you also need to make sure that you know where you're going to stand on the team and what you're going to bring to your roster, and if that's the best fit for you. Like, there are some athletes who, like, maybe they want to go to a Power 5 school even if they're not on the travel team, and it's just a dream of theirs to be a Power 5 athlete. That's totally fine. Like, you can absolutely pursue that. There are going to be some runners who, or some just athletes in general, who maybe want to be the best on their team, and that's totally fine for you. But you have to figure out what you want competitively out of your school as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right about that. And it sounds like you had, you were checking every box that you needed to check, right? There was a very good balance of all of these things. So once you finally get to, well, before we even get there, what year did you finally commit to WKU? Was it in that junior year when you were getting all of these letters, or was it much later?
Yeah, I waited until signing day of my senior year. I didn't want to, commit right off the bat after making that decision to specialize. Like, I wanted to give myself time to improve and expand my options and see what offers were available. So I waited until February of my senior year to actually sign my national letter of intent.
Yeah, I mean, most athletes, once they start getting letters, they're gung ho to be like, okay, I want to go here, I want to go here, I want to look here, and they're ready to commit. How did you stay patient throughout that entire process and weigh all the different options that were coming to you?
I'm an overthinker, so that all comes really naturally to me anyway. I don't like making decisions without sitting and thinking about them for a long time. And the recruiting process is actually really perfect for that, because you do get a lot of feedback throughout or you should at least get a lot of feedback
Hmm.
from coaches about, like, this is how, like, these are how many scholarships, like, spots I have available. This is what my roster looks like. Sometimes you have coaches who, like, they'll move schools, during your recruiting process. And so that's an important thing to keep an eye on. But for me, like, it really comes naturally to just like wait things out and only make a decision when I absolutely have to. For some athletes that might, not be their nature, or that might not be something that they want to do. But I always recommend that athletes be super, super patient with their recruiting process. And I mean, you don't even have to sign like on the national letter of intent signing. You can wait. Like, you don't have to do all of these things within a standard timeline, as long as you are paying a lot of attention to your coaches, your potential coaches, and that you're communicating with them, and make sure that you're following through on the deadlines that you assign. So, like, if you want to sign, if you don't want to sign on National Signing Day, just let them know, and make sure that you're communicating with everybody involved, and that you know where you stand scholarship wise, if that's important, because you don't have your scholarship set in stone until you
Hmm.
sign those papers. That's something we get a lot of hype about like National Signing Day and everything that goes with that, and like everyone wants to post a picture on Instagram and whatnot, and that's fine. But you don't have to feel pressured to sign a national letter of intent on that day. And the papers that you should really, really be concerned about are your scholarship papers, because that is what is set in stone. You want to make sure that you're reading those carefully and making sure that you're not signing up for something that you were misled about, or like if your coach promised you a 4-year deal during the recruiting process, but that's not showing up on your papers. You want to make sure that you're nailing down all of those details. So, for me, it's all about patience and making your recruiting timeline work for you. And even if, you need to decommit and recommit, just not being afraid of making the decisions that are best for you.
Yeah, for sure. You're absolutely right about that. And so you make your decision, you sign, you wait to sign until February. Now you get on campus. You're not far from home, but you're far enough away. Is there any growing pains? Is there any culture shock? What's that transition like for you once you get on campus?
Growing pains is such a good way to describe it, because, I had been going to WKU for like basketball and football games for years. I grew up military, so like I was moving around all of the time, but we had been in Kentucky for the last like 8 or so years by the time I got to college. So it wasn't like I was in a completely different place. What was really a curveball for me was the increase in academic expectations, which is like from the outside probably looks really weird to people because I'm a very good student. But the
Hmm.
problem was like getting to college, I just like I didn't know how to study. Like I had to learn how to study because I never had to study in high school. So like I took a basic like broadcasting 101 class, and I remember we had an exam coming up and I didn't dedicate any time to studying. We had like a study group that was a part of the class that was completely optional. And I was like, I don't need to go to the study group. Like I got this. I got like a 71 on my first test. And I was like, this is like, I understand that C's get degrees, but I was like, no, like I'm an A student. Like I can't be getting C's on my test.
Yeah.
And so I started going to that study group and I'd squeaked out an A. I had like a 90 or a 91 in that class. So I managed to squeak out an A at the end of the semester, but I made it really stressful for myself just because I had no idea how to study. So there was
Hmm.
that. And then the training schedule was also a lot for me because I was a very low mileage runner. And a lot of I see so many distance coaches do this in the NCAA where they put like a blanket mileage requirement for all of their runners. They'll say like, oh, everybody needs to run like 80 miles a week. And for me, I was like, I did really well in high school running like 25 to 30. And then in college, like my best performances I did when I was running like 50 miles a week or 60 miles a week, which sounds like a lot. Like, and even me looking back on that, I'm like, that's a lot of running because I don't really run
Yeah.
anymore. But from like a D1 athlete perspective, 50 to 60 miles a week is nothing when you're an elite runner. And I didn't always have coaches who understood that. So like when I first came into like training in the fall, my coaches just jacked up my mileage and I wasn't doing well from like a fueling perspective and making sure that I
Hmm.
was eating enough. That was always really hard for me as an athlete because when you're running so much, I mean, you just burn through calories like it's nothing. And so like it's not abnormal at all for like a female athlete on a pretty low mileage plan to be eating like 3 to 4,000 calories a day, which was way more than I was used to. So like I had issues with figuring out how much I needed to eat to support all of that training. I had a couple of like minor injuries and tweaks, like I was having hip issues. And so it was like a bunch of little things were piling up on me from a training perspective, and then adding in like the extra stress of adapting to like college academics was also really hard. So like my freshman year was nothing special. Like I maybe PR'd once or twice, but I had really lofty expectations for myself going into Division I sports. I was like, I want to be running like low 18s by the end of the year, like maybe breaking into the 17s for a 5K. And like that didn't happen. And so I was really hard on myself after, you know, that first year. I also had a coach at the end of my freshman year. She came up to me after our conference meet for outdoor, which is in the spring. So like the entire year was over. Like I was done. I wasn't feeling great about my performances. And she was like, okay, Katie, that was your warning year. You know, if you mess up like that again next year, I'm pulling your scholarships. I was like, oh boy, okay, like this is not good. So my
Yeah.
first year was like you said, growing pains is such a great way to describe it. My freshman year was not great. And I had to really like learn to adapt to college at the academic and the athletic level really quickly because of that.
Hmm. Yeah, and as you're going through, the academic transition and everything else, you mentioned that you changed your major as well. When did you change your major, and what were your other majors before you got the one that you wanted?
Yeah, I changed my major twice in college. And then it's funny because like I in grad school, it's kind of a similar situation for me where like I started out in one field and I tried to stay in that field for my doctorate, but then I changed halfway through. So it's like I always have trouble like landing where I need to land. But with yeah, so with my undergrad, I started out in broadcasting, and then it was halfway through my sophomore year. I was getting into my classes, and I love my classes. I love broadcasting classes, and it's such a heavy, like a writing heavy major, which a lot of people don't understand about broadcasting. And I love writing, and so I really loved like the screenwriting process of broadcasting and like finding stories. But I was looking at the job market, and I was like, okay, I want to be like a sports center anchor. Like that's what's really going to make me happy in life is being, you know, a big time sports media person. And I just
Hmm.
looked at like the process it took to get there, and I was thinking like I'm not happy with the way that this looks from a career trajectory standpoint. Like I want something more stable. And so I decided to go into kinesiology. because I was like, I'm an athlete, so like exercise science is going to be easy. And it was not. I was terrible at kinesiology. And so I only spent about half a semester in kinesiology and then I was like, I can't handle this workload. And I don't even think this is what I want to do either. So I went to my athletic advisor, and it's so ironic because so much of my work right now is very critical of the NCAA, but the NCAA actually pushed me towards the career that I'm in now because of their progress towards degree rule. So like at that point during my academic career, I wouldn't have been over the NCAA's threshold for my progress towards degree if I were to switch to dietetics, which was what I like plan C for me. I was like, okay, I want to be a dietitian. And so my advisor was like, well, you know, you can't switch to that major, so why don't we look at your options? And her top option for me, based on my academic history, was communication studies. And so like in my mind, I was like, okay, like this is a good career. Like it's pretty, it's a good foundation for a career. Like there are lots of jobs in communication studies. I could go a journalism route. I could possibly get back into broadcasting if I find out that's really what I want to do. And if not, like there are a ton of, like there's a ton of jobs in tech. There are a ton of jobs in like marketing and advertising. So like this is the stability that I'm looking for while still staying in my interests. And then from there, I went to grad school, started critical research on the NCAA in communication studies. So like it's really funny because I would have never landed in my critical research field about the NCAA if it wasn't for the NCAA and what I think is a pretty unnecessary rule in terms of progress towards degree, because I don't think the NCAA really has any business determining what college athletes should be doing athletically and academically, and what works best for them from an academic standpoint. So it's kind of funny just how things worked out for me in that way.
Yeah. And you finally land on, what you actually want to do. And once you get there, is that when you start? I mean, obviously you just mentioned the career trajectory of all these other majors, but is that when you really started to hone in on, okay, this is what I want to do, and this is where this is where I think I could be going?
Yeah, and so when I switched to communication studies, that was when I met who would become my graduate advisor, Dr. Angie Jerome, and then like during my junior year, I actually had a knee injury that pushed me to grad school. Because I wanted to be able to use my fifth year, and I couldn't do that unless I was a full-time student. So I was kind of like, well, I was leaning towards grad school anyway, and now, I need it to use up this fifth year of eligibility. I can get it funded. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to get my master's. And that was what really pushed me towards my career today as a doctoral candidate right now, getting my degree, working with 2-a-days on like educational resources and editorial services. But what really pushed me in that direction was actually during grad school. It was during the Larry Nassar trial. Because I was working on a project in Dr. Jerome's class, and it was a critical analysis of NCAA policy, because we were allowed to choose any like public communication from an organization to study for this class. And I was like, well, I'm going to choose some NCAA policy because I want to figure out like the nuts and bolts of this organization, how everything works. And it was during the Larry Nassar scandal when there was a headline that came out that really shifted the trajectory of my career, because it read something like Michigan State University cleared of all wrongdoing in the Larry Nassar scandal. And during this time, I'm reading this NCAA policy book, and I'm like, I know why he was cleared, because there aren't any rules against sexually abusing athletes. Like there are no enforceable NCAA rules against it. And so it was that realization that made me see like, okay, this is important work. I really need to understand how the NCAA operates as a whole and as an organization, and just these negative impacts on athletes that are really rooted in policy. So yeah, it's all the NCAA's fault though. Like if they hadn't stepped in with the progress towards degree rules, then I would never be, I would have probably just been like a dietitian or something. Like I probably would have been working with athletes. I still think to this day, if I hadn't gone to grad school, I'd be working in the sports industry to some capacity, but it would not be the same way I'm doing it now.
Yeah. So let's dive into that a little bit more with your role with 2-a-days. What's a day-to-day look like for you as somebody who's doing research and working with different papers, and obviously, and also going to school?
Yeah, it's work-life balance has always been tricky for me because I think a lot of athletes struggle with this where we're just like go, 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 go all the
Hmm.
time. And we have trouble like slowing down and taking time for ourselves. So like something that I've learned to do with juggling my job at two-a-days and freelancing and my dissertation and the classes that I teach is I've learned to like section off one day a week where I don't do anything. Like that's my off day. It's a very firm boundary that I have. Like my friends know, like don't call me, like don't don't text me. Like I'm off the grid on Sundays. So like having Sundays as a complete rest day really helps me to structure the rest of my week because then I can be like, okay, I teach Tuesday, Thursday. So like I've got a few hours like sectioned off there. Then I'm on campus and working on my dissertation. So like I have dissertation time built in. Mondays and Tuesdays are also editorial days for two-a-days where I'm scheduling articles for a few weeks in advance. And then I'm also editing articles that are going to be going up the following week. So I always like to stay a week ahead of the publication schedule on two-a-days because working as head editorial, I have to stay like super on top of things and organized there. So like I found that sectioning off my days and the work that I do on specific days is really helpful where, Monday, Tuesday, I have my editing days, Tuesday, Thursdays are teaching days. Wednesdays, I usually grade and work on my dissertation. And then Thursday and Fridays are dissertation and job application days. So like sectioning off my days like that is super, super helpful. Then I schedule more articles on Saturday. I take Sunday completely off. And so having light weekends is also a really helpful aspect of that and just making sure that I'm taking care of myself while also getting done everything that I need to get done.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. As athletes, we have a lot of trouble flipping that switch and turning things off. Um, that kind of takes us into, that balance, right? And for you, what was that transition like where, you're going into grad school, you want to continue to compete a little bit. How do you transition outside of the competition, Katie, to the professional Katie, who is having to block off her Sundays and everything else? Was there kind of a transition period in there where you're like, man, I don't know who I am without being an athlete? Or was it just like, hey, we're already in this realm, we're already doing these things. We're going to transition all of the focus that we have as an athlete to, what we do as a professional. Was there sort of a balance in there, or was it kind of tough for you to make that transition?
It was a really, really difficult transition because, once I committed to being a runner, my junior year of high school, like I was Katie the runner, like that was my identity. And even, like living in smaller towns like Elizabethtown and Bowling Green, like a lot of people knew who I was. They knew me as Katie the runner. They didn't know me before I started running. And so like it was such a huge part of my identity and it was such a huge source of like praise and accolades for me that I really didn't know who I was when I was forced to stop. And actually like the summer in between my first and second year of grad school, which was when my eligibility ran out, I kind of went through this period of depression and I recognize it as depression now because I, at the time, had no idea what it was. I was just like, man,
Hmm.
I feel really crappy and like I'm having trouble getting out of bed and I don't know why because I'm not running anymore. Like I'm not like physically exhausted, but I am, so I was really confused about, I didn't know what was going on. But that summer was very, very difficult for me because I was having to figure out who I was as a person without running while also still dealing with some residual injuries. And so being in some physical pain and doing physical therapy and figuring out how to incorporate exercise into my life in a healthy way, because it's something that I still really, really love to do. Something that helped immensely with that whole process was actually getting involved with a CrossFit gym in Bowling Green. It's CrossFit Old School, and they're a phenomenal woman-owned gym in Bowling Green that I absolutely love. But I was pushed by a friend in grad school who was like, you want to get stronger, you want to injury proof yourself. This is a good way to do it. And at first I was like, like injury proofing myself through CrossFit, that sounds really fake. But I had really good coaches who taught me good form and who really, really helped shape me as an athlete outside of college sports, which was a
Hmm.
super, super instrumental process. In sort of reclaiming who I was. And then moving to Austin was a huge deal too, because nobody knew me in Austin. So I wasn't Katie the runner anymore. I was just Katie. and what I struggled with there was I became Katie, the doctoral student. And so I started sort of putting that identity in my work that I was doing academically. And I'm a very, very public scholar. So I'm publishing a lot of like freelance work, and I put a lot of my identity in that. And so that switch from identifying myself through my sport to identifying myself through my professional, like just through who I was as a professional, was it was really hard because I thought like, oh, once running ends, I won't be so consumed with this. And I wasn't consumed with running, but I was consumed with my professional work. So it's been difficult to find that balance, but I found that, being in a new place where I'm not Katie the runner was really, really helpful, and finding good communities and investing in relationships has been a really, really important part of figuring out who I am as a person rather than like who I am as a worker. And that was something I just didn't have time to do as an athlete. Like I didn't have a lot of friends outside of my team. I didn't socialize a lot. And so just learning how to cut myself a little bit of slack and be social and find another physical outlet for me to engage in has been super, super helpful. And then also being competitive in my professional work and like finding weightlifting competitions and things to do. So channeling that competitive energy, I think, is also really helpful for athletes if they can find some kind of community and avenue to do that through. It's really important, I think, for athletes to get that out of their system.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. As an athlete or as an ex-athlete, I try to make sure that I'm in the gym, right? You have to have that sort of outlet of, excess. I can still do it, right? Where you think that you can still compete a little bit, so you have to get in the gym. You have to do something, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
but when it comes to your professional life, and you talked about it a little bit in your intro of dealing with injuries and dealing with coaches who weren't probably the most supportive, right? A little bit abusive when it came to, supporting you. How much of that experience do you think you take into your professional research where you're like, this is something that I dealt with. This is something that I'm looking into in the NCAA. How much of that would you say is not a bias, but more of a driving factor of what you're looking into?
Yeah, my experiences as a college athlete and just my interest in the sports industry in general, like they really drive my research interest in a way that I think makes it more personal. And I love that about what I do, because I think that the best research, is going to have a personal angle to it. Because bias, that's a word that it's like a swear word in academia. Like, we don't say that we're biased. We
Yeah.
don't say that we're not objective, but there's going to be bias in any research that you do, even if you're using like quantitative methods and you're dealing with statistics. There's going to be a bias in like what you publish, how you write it. Bias exists in all research. And so
Mhm.
with that in mind, like I really think that it's the scholars that have a personal investment in their interests that really, really do a great job in bringing out the best in their research. And so there are some scholars that I've tried really hard to imitate in that perspective, where they have these experiences that shape who they are as an academic, and they use that not to make their research try to fit any certain agenda or like trying to skew the results, but they use that to drive their research in a really interesting and engaging and important way. And the way that I do that really is through my public scholarship, so much more than anything else. Because I use these experiences to not only write papers for my for my degree and get them published, but also to make sure that I'm keeping up with the news cycle and that I'm informing people of like abusive coaching dynamics and updates and policies so that they can best use that in real time. Because the real disadvantage of academic publishing is that it takes forever to get out. There's a lot of politics involved and a lot of just checks and balances and just procedural red tape and things that I'm not a huge fan of. It's also very hard to access. There are a bunch of paywalls for these academic journals. There's a lot of merit in publishing academically, but I really think that there's also a lot of merit in publishing publicly. And so with my experiences, I really try to make sure that I'm getting things out in a timely manner so that athletes who are going through these same things can figure out ways to best make sense of them and deal with them themselves as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, as a journalist myself, it's why I try not to script conversations such as this one, because I don't want to have my own main objective of, what the conversation should be. I want it to be able to just kind of flow naturally, right? So, I find that when you do go into something with so many scripted questions or something like that, you may completely lose what somebody says and not actually listen to what they're saying and allow the conversation to go where it goes. So, that is something that I always love asking people that do research is, how much of that research would you say is, you know, enforcing your own biases or
Mhm.
enforcing your own opinions. And so it's always good to hear, yes, you do take some of your own biases and opinions into it, but it's how you present that, and was it hard for you to find that voice once you started writing these things of this isn't something that I'm just writing to validate my own experiences, but it is something that I feel needs to be out there?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. I feel like I was just born to write. It's one of these like skills of mine that I work very hard at, but it's not anything that I've ever struggled to do. I think everyone has their gifts and their talents that are kind of innate to them, and writing is mine. So it's always really been second nature for me to make sense of things and to try to educate people through writing. So to have a career field that fits that natural tendency of mine so well has really just been a really great experience. And I think it's my focus on education, I think, that prevents me from making it all about me and about my experiences, because I think it's good that they inform what I do, but I don't want to always be the subject of my writing. I don't think I'm a
Mhm.
particularly interesting person that all of my writing needs to be about myself. And I think that, in educating people about the entire scope of college athletics, like that's how I'm going to be most effective. So like with two-a-days, I remember with like the whole name, image, and likeness conversation, I was reading bills. I was like keeping track of which ones were being passed into law. I was writing about like, here's how the word should in this bill functions rather than the word will or could, and like what that means for college athletes. And so that was a really cool experience for me where I could take my expertise and like my experiences as a pre-NIL athlete and use them for something that's educational and useful for athletes who are going through sort of the confusion and the chaos of name, image, and likeness now.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So I want to move on to our final segment called Five Questions. And these are things that I've kind of picked up from you as our conversation has gone. And so first question for you is, you said your dad would introduce you to female sports from a young age. And you mentioned, I believe it was your birthday was on Pat Summitt's thousandth win. Who is one of these, or maybe even a couple of these female athletes that you looked up to as a young athlete?
Oh man, I remember I watched a ton of Tennessee sports because of Pat Summitt. So I'm a little bit biased here, but Candace Parker was a big one for me. I watched her play when she was at Tennessee, and I've watched her, in the WNBA as well. And she's just such a
Mhm.
brilliant broadcaster too. I love watching her commentary too. So she's been a big one for me. I also watched Monica Abbott a lot growing up. She's a professional pitcher, and she also pitched for Tennessee as well. So I really liked watching her like develop as an athlete. There's also Taryn Mowat. She was a pitcher for Arizona, and I loved her because she was a really strong off-speed pitcher, and that was like my bread and butter as a pitcher. So like seeing an athlete at the college level doing like what I was doing in high school was super super cool. And then there's also Jessica Mendoza. I absolutely loved watching, and I didn't watch her so much as an athlete because she was kind of before I started getting into softball, but I loved watching her
Mhm.
commentary in the Women's College World Series, and now she's doing it for Major League Baseball. And I just like she's one person I would really love to meet before I die. I just love Jessica Mendoza. And Holly Rowe, I know she's not
Yeah.
an athlete either, but like being someone who wanted to be a broadcaster growing up, seeing female broadcasters just absolutely crush it was so cool for me. And I think it's just really cool that girls have that growing up now. So like anytime I see Holly Rowe, I'm like, oh, it's Holly Rowe. Everybody shut up. I have to watch.
Throughout your recruiting process, and you said that your mom went on a lot of these trips, but what was something that she told you that kind of stuck with you and helped you make your decision?
Yeah, my mom, something that she told me, and I'm going to paraphrase her. It's not an exact quote, but she basically told me like, Katie, this is not a 4-year decision. Like this is a rest of your life decision. And I just think that perspective was super, super helpful because, you know, as a high schooler, you're like, oh, this is going to be like the next 4 years of my life. And that sounds like a really long time, but it's not. But it's really about how that 4 years is going to set you up to be who you want to be for the rest of your life. So my mom really emphasized that like, this is not a 4-year decision. This is a rest of your life decision. So you need to really be thinking about it like that and taking it very seriously.
Yeah. Um, what was your first published piece, and how nervous were you when it went out to the world?
My very first published piece, it was fortuitous, because I I was blogging for like a long time before I ended up as a freelancer at Two A Days. I was blogging
Mhm.
on my personal blog. It wasn't doing well. So I was like, I'm going to promote this to like a Facebook page. I found a parents of college athletes Facebook page, and I put my blog on there. I was like, hey, y'all might be interested in this. It was a blog on NCAA policy. So like, it wasn't very exciting, but people were interested. And one of those people was my now boss, Kirsten Sayers, who messaged me, and she was like, hey, do you want to write an article for us? And I was like, yeah, sure. So it started off with one article about scholarship, like NCAA scholarship policies, and a lot of things that we were talking about at the beginning of the show, like how they're not guaranteed always and stuff like that. And that was when
Mhm.
I was like, ooh, I'm really, really excited to get this one out, because I was like, I'm getting paid for this one. So it felt really legit. It wasn't just me like, putting my work up on a blog, which like, there's nothing wrong with that. And I totally encourage people to do that when they're starting out with like writing and just being public with their work. But I was like, ooh, I'm legit now. I'm getting paid. Like if I were a college athlete, I couldn't compete if I were doing this. Like this is a big deal. So I was really, really proud of my very first piece, even though looking back at it, I'm like, this is kind of basic information, but it's still really important. And it was a very important piece for me.
Yeah. Going back to your competition days, what's one event that stands out to you as, I can compete here, or maybe it was too overwhelming, or just something that really stuck out to you at an event from when you competed?
That would have to be my 10K PR. We went to Stanford. It was me and one other teammate of mine, and we went because we were trying to qualify for NCAA regionals. Um, and I ended up running a PR, and it's still like my long-standing PR. I never PR'd after that race, but I ran a 34:30 10K. And looking back on that, I'm like, I will never do that again, first of all. But it was one of those days where I was like, I finished the race and I was like, I just reached a goal that I never thought I would as an athlete, and I beat some Power 5 runners. And like, that was such a huge deal for me. The first time I ever broke 17, and the 5K also falls under that category, because it was at Vanderbilt. They had a gorgeous new indoor track facility. And I got
Mhm.
second in the race overall. And that still like haunts me to this day. But like, it was such a huge PR for me. And it was again, like just the fact that I was going up against Power 5 athletes and beating them, that I was like, wow, I never thought that like as a mid-major athlete, I could do that.
Yeah. So last question, and it's the same one everyone gets, is what's a piece of advice that you've either learned through your research? I kind of think this one is going to be a little bit different for you, obviously, because you're digging into so much research for college athletes. What is a piece of advice that you would pass on to them that you really feel that they should know?
I think it's so important just to own who you are. That's something that I've really struggled with as a scholar in particular, because I'm not a traditional scholar. I'm not the kind of person that I'm like, oh, I'm gonna, turn out a ton of research articles. I'm gonna try to get as many lines on my CV as possible. For me, I'm more about like, how can I take this information and translate it into something that's very immediately useful and very public facing. I also like to add sort of an air of whimsy and fun to my scholarship. So like, my scholarship is critical in nature, but like, I have a piece that I just published in a peer-reviewed journal about college game day signs and how they promote different aspects of hegemonic masculinity. There's another piece that I have out where I'm allegorizing pandemic college football to the Hunger Games, because we were like sacrificing young people on television for entertainment, that I'm trying to also get out in a public, in a peer-reviewed journal. And that's not like, it's not like normal scholarship, but where I'm most effective. It adds an air of creativity and fun to what I do. And it's what I like to do the most and where I'm most effective as a scholar and a researcher. And so, a big part of my development there has just been owning the fact that like, I'm not a normal scholar. Like I'm not traditional, and that's okay. And even with like my freelancing, it's like, I don't go about this in like what I viewed as a normal way, like writing with an actual, like with a New York Times kind of company and like, staying there in a full-time position. It's like, I'd rather like freelance around and see where I can get published and the different audiences that I can reach. And that's also okay. So with a lot of these different procedures we have growing up, including the recruiting process, we get told like, this is the way that you need to do this. And sometimes that can be good advice, but I would just advise younger people to just own who you are and operate on your own timeline and in your own way, as long as it's effective for you.
Yeah, that's awesome. And this has been a great conversation. I really, really appreciate you taking some time to discuss, everything, your career, both as an athlete and now as a scholar. Before we let you go, let us know, where can we find your work? Where are you at on social media? I'm sure that you are posting and putting some things out there. So let us know where we can find you.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me, Katie Lever. I like to connect with people there. I'm most primarily on Instagram and Twitter, which hopefully doesn't die in the next couple. I keep hearing like, oh, Twitter's going to die. But I'm on Instagram and Twitter, and my handle is Lever Fever. And I post a lot about like college sports and just stuff going on in the news, as much of my research as possible. And Instagram, I do like, fun pictures and stuff like that. But I also post a lot of articles on there too. So you get kind of a good feel for who I am on social media, I think.
That's awesome. That's great. We'll definitely be looking out for it. Good luck with the rest of your research. We'll certainly be reading that as well. Katie, I really appreciate you joining the A2A podcast today, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ryan. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Athletes to Athletes podcast. To make sure you don't miss when a new episode comes your way, head to the Athletes to Athletes YouTube page to like and subscribe, or to Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcast. Again, we appreciate you listening, and we'll see you again next time.